It was the spring of 1987 when 27-year-old Cecily Bowen found herself standing in a wheat field that stretched to the edge of the world, holding a death certificate in one hand and an overdue bank notice in the other. The field was hers now, all 940 acres of it, and it was trying to kill her. Her father, Thomas Bowen, had died on a Tuesday in March, quiet as a candle going out. A heart attack in the cab of his old Alice Chalmers, somewhere between the south fence line and the equipment shed. The paramedics said he'd probably been gone an hour before anyone noticed the tractor idling alone in the field, its front wheels pressed softly against a fence post like a tired animal leaning against a gate. That was how Thomas Bowen died, at work, doing what he'd always done. Cecily had driven out from Kansas City the same night, her hands white-knuckled on the wheel the whole 4 hours, arriving at the old farmhouse in the dark to find the porch light on. Her father had always left it on for her, and nobody inside. Just the smell of him, coffee and machine oil, and the particular dry wood smell of a house that had stood through 100 winters. Her husband, Mitchell, had followed in his own car 2 days later. He stood in the driveway in his good shoes and looked at the equipment shed, then at the fields, then at Cecily, and she could see him calculating, adding up the numbers and finding them not to his liking. He lasted 3 weeks. "This isn't a farm," he told her the morning he packed his bag, his voice flat and certain, the voice he used in boardrooms. "It's a liability. It hasn't turned a real profit in years. Your father was farming out of stubbornness, not sense." He snapped the suitcase latches. "Sell it, Ceci. Take what you can get and come home. This isn't your life." She didn't answer him. She just watched him from the kitchen doorway, her coffee going cold in her hand, and she thought about how her father used to say that some men measure everything in money because it's the only unit of value they've ever been taught. Mitchell's taillights disappeared around the bend in the county road, and the silence that moved in after him was enormous and specific. It wasn't peaceful. It pressed on her chest like a hand. The kitchen table was buried under delinquent notices. An outstanding equipment loan, a property tax statement, and a handwritten list in her father's careful print. Maintenance items on the Alice Chalmers she'd found tucked under the wiper blade. The morning they brought him home, even dying, he'd been thinking about the machine. "Now let me tell you about the situation Cecily walked into, because without it, you can't understand what she did." The late 1980s in western Kansas were a slow-motion reckoning. The get big or get out fever of the 70s hadn't just passed through the agricultural plains. It had set up permanent residents. Neighbors she'd known since childhood had borrowed against everything, bought more land, bought bigger equipment, expanded their operations on the faith that commodity prices would climb forever and interest rates would stay friendly. They had farm magazines spread on their kitchen tables and loan officers on speed dial, and a confidence that, looking back, had the unmistakable shape of something right before it breaks. Her father had watched all of it from his fence line and said nothing, which was his way. Thomas Bowen had a phrase he used when someone asked him why he didn't expand, why he didn't borrow against the acreage the way everyone else was doing. "Debt is a hole you dig yourself," he'd say, "and you always dig it faster than you fill it back in." People smiled politely at that, the way people smile at an old man's sayings. Quietly, they thought he was behind the times. Cecily had heard the whispers her whole childhood, that her father was too cautious, too old-fashioned, too attached to doing things his own way when the modern way was faster and bigger and better. She'd half believed it herself at 20, when she left for college and then for Kansas City and a marketing job, and the life that Mitchell had seemed to represent progress, forward motion. Now she was standing in her father's kitchen, reading an equipment note that was 60 days past due, and somewhere to the south the Alice Chalmers was sitting in the shed with a cracked fuel injection line and a hydraulic cylinder that wept fluid every time you engaged the loader. She was 27 years old. She had a marketing degree and a practical knowledge of spreadsheets, and she knew almost nothing about fixing a tractor. What she did know was this: the wheat was coming up. Her father had planted winter wheat in October, 5 months before he died, and the green shoots were already breaking the soil in long, patient rows. The field didn't know Thomas Bowen was gone. It was going to need harvesting in June, whether she was ready or not. She drove into town the following Monday to meet with Mr. Garrity at the First Consolidated Agricultural Bank of Perryton, a man with the smooth manner of someone who delivered bad news so many times it had ceased to cost him anything. He had a folder on his desk with her name on it. That told her enough. "Cecily," he said, folding his hands, "I want you to know I thought the world of your father. Tom was a good man, and I want to help you." He paused in the particular way people pause when they're about to say something that doesn't actually help. The note on the equipment is 60 days overdue. The operating loan was in arrears when Tom passed. With the estate still in probate and no clear plan of operation, he spread his hands. The bank has an obligation to its own position. She waited. "There's a group out of Amarillo," he said, lowering his voice to something meant to sound like confidence. "They're consolidating parcels in this county, looking for good ground. They'd cover all outstanding debt and put money in your pocket. You could walk away clean." She looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Garrity had kind eyes and a good suit, and absolutely no idea who he was talking to. "I'm not walking away," she said. He blinked. The kindness in his eyes shifted slightly to something adjacent to pity. "Cecily, the fuel injection on the Alice Chalmers alone is going to cost. I know what it's going to cost," she said. "I'm not selling." She drove home and didn't let herself think about whether she was right or wrong. Thinking too hard about it was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she went directly to the equipment shed. Let me stop here a moment and tell you something about Thomas Bowen's equipment shed, because it was unlike any I've ever had described to me. Other farmers' sheds were chaos, parts bins overflowing, manuals stacked in milk crates, oil cans without lids, mystery bolts in coffee tins. Thomas Bowen's shed was a different country. Every tool hung on a painted pegboard with its shadow outline behind it, so you could see at a glance what was missing. The shelves held service manuals, their spines labeled in black marker, sorted by machine and year. On a workbench against the east wall sat a green metal lockbox, and inside that box, divided into sections by hand-cut cardboard dividers, were receipts, part numbers, and a running log of every repair he had ever made, cross-referenced by machine, by date, and by symptom. The most recent entry was dated 9 days before he died. Alice 7:45, fuel delivery sluggish, at cold start. Suspect cracked secondary injection line. Ordered replacement, part no. 7-1 should arrive week of March 14. Also, loader hydraulic cylinder showing slow seep at rod seal, not urgent but watch it. Seal kit part no. 7-0-9922. Cecily sat on the workbench stool and read that entry 3 times. He'd already ordered the part. It was sitting at the co-op in town, uncollected, waiting for a man who wasn't coming to pick it up. She drove to the co-op that afternoon and paid for the part with the farm checking account, which had $412 in it. She brought the part home and set it on the workbench and opened the service manual for the Alice Chalmers 7045 to the fuel system section. Her father had paper-clipped the relevant pages. He'd written notes in the margin in his small, blocky hand. She read until midnight. Then she started. "Have you ever disassembled something you've never touched before? In the middle of the night with no one to ask, knowing that if you do it wrong, the entire season is over. That is a very specific kind of quiet inside your own head. It strips everything away except the thing directly in front of you. She worked from the manual and from her father's margin notes, and when she didn't understand something, she read the paragraph again and again until she did. She laid each part on a clean shop rag in the exact order she removed it, the way he had shown her once when she was 12, and too impatient to do it right, she made herself do it right now. At 4:30 in the morning, she started the tractor. The engine turned over, caught, and settled into an idle that was clean and even. She sat in the cold dark of the shed and listened to it run. There was no one to tell. She told it to herself, inside her chest, where it settled like ballast. The first season was something she would not fully describe to people even years later, because there were no words for it that didn't sound like complaint. And she wasn't a person who complained. She hired one part-time hand for harvest, a retired farmer named Gus, who didn't ask too many questions, and showed up every morning at 5:30 with his own coffee. She fixed the hydraulic cylinder on the loader herself, using her father's seal kit and his log entry as a guide. She learned to grease fittings and read dipsticks and listened for sounds that weren't right. The way her father had always listened, his head slightly cocked, patient as a man hearing weather in the distance. The neighbors watched. She knew they watched, because that's how small communities work, not unkindly, but watchfully, tracking the odds on an outcome they'd already decided on. At the feed store and the co-op and the diner on Main, the consensus was sympathetic and certain. The Bowen place would go to the Amarillo group by fall. It was sad, but it was simple math. Cecily heard this secondhand and said nothing. She was too busy for anything else. She did not buy new equipment. She did not hire a crew. She did not eat at restaurants, or buy new clothes, or do anything that cost money she didn't have. She sold grain at the elevator, and every dollar that wasn't diesel or groceries went straight to the banknote. She bartered with Gus. She kept his mower blade sharp all summer, and he helped her true up the wobble in her grain auger without charging her labor. She traded 2 days of hauling for a neighbor's use of his post-hole digger to fix a fence line that had been sagging since her father's illness. She was living the way her father had lived, small, careful, deeply attentive to what she had and what it needed. The winter between her first and second year was when she almost broke. January came in hard that year. An ice storm dropped a half-inch of glaze on everything for 3 days straight. Then a cold front followed it and locked the whole county in a deep freeze for 2 weeks. The power flickered out on a Wednesday and stayed out until the following Tuesday. The pipes in the farmhouse, which had been old when Thomas Bowen moved in, and older now, froze somewhere in the wall behind the kitchen, and she woke on a Friday morning to the sound of water running where no water should be running. She stood in the kitchen in her father's old barn coat and her wool socks, and looked at the spreading wet stain on the linoleum, and she let herself feel, for exactly 2 minutes, the full weight of everything. The cold, the isolation, the particular exhaustion of being responsible for something enormous all by yourself. Mitchell's voice in her head, certain and measured. Sell it. Take what you can get. 2 minutes. Then she went to find the main shutoff. She had a propane camp stove and 4 days of food, and her father's transistor radio and the green metal lockbox. She lit the stove and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the lockbox open in front of her, looking through it. Not for any particular reason, just because it was where her father had put his careful attention, and she wanted to be near that. Tucked into the back section, behind a manila envelope of warranty cards, she found a photograph she'd never seen. Her father was maybe 35 in it, standing in front of the Alice Chalmers, the same one, younger, with one hand resting on its hood. He was looking at the camera the way he looked at most things, without performance. Just present, just steady. On the back, in a different hand, her grandmother's, she thought, from the curling F's, were 4 words: "He tends what he loves." Cecily held the photograph for a long time. The camp stove hissed. Outside, the county road was a sheet of gray ice, and the fields were locked under 2 inches of snow, and not one soul knew exactly what she was sitting with. She got up and fixed the pipe. It took her 2 days. One day to figure out where it had split, and one day to get the repair parts from a hardware store 30 miles away on roads. She drove at 15 miles an hour because they were still bad. She soldered the joint herself, watching a demonstration on a battery-powered DVD player 4 times until she understood the technique. When she turned the water back on and nothing leaked, she stood at the sink for a moment with her hands under the running faucet, just feeling the warmth of it. The second sign of things turning wasn't dramatic either. It was the soil. Thomas Bowen had always rotated his crops and planted winter cover crops when other farmers left their fields bare after harvest. The county extension agent had once driven out to tell him that he could get more out of his ground if he pushed it harder, used more inputs, ran it at maximum capacity. Her father had listened politely and thanked the man and gone on doing exactly what he'd always done. By Cecily's second year, she could see what he'd meant. Her father's fields didn't crust over after rain the way the neighboring fields did. The ground stayed darker, looser, more willing. When she dug into it with a spade, the earthworms were there, which her father had always said was the only soil test that mattered. Her input costs were a fraction of what her neighbors were spending on fertilizer to replace what they'd mined out of their ground. She wasn't getting record yields, but she was getting consistent ones, and her land was getting better each year, rather than slower and harder. Then, in 1989, the reckoning arrived. It had been coming for years, visible to anyone who was watching the right things. Commodity prices had stalled. Interest rates, which had seemed to stabilize, lurched upward again. Operating loans that had seemed manageable when times were good became millstones when margins tightened. Banks that had aggressively pushed expansion loans now had agricultural portfolios hemorrhaging red ink and loan officers whose confident smiles had gone tight and pale. The foreclosure signs started appearing in the spring. First, it was the Tillman operation. 1,200 acres on the East County line. 4 generations of family farming ended in a single auction on a cold March morning. Then the brothers who farmed the section north of town, who had bought 3 new John Deeres in the span of 4 years, found the bank calling those loans due simultaneously. Then the Wexler farm, whose owner had been one of the men at the feed store who'd spoken most confidently about Cecily's inability to make it. She heard about each one. She didn't say anything. Her own situation was different in a way that was so simple it almost embarrassed her to say out loud. She didn't owe much. Her father's note was nearly paid off. She owned her equipment free and clear, ancient as it was. When commodity prices dropped, it hurt her margins, but it didn't threaten her existence. She planted her spring crop, tended her fence lines, serviced her equipment, and kept the green metal lockbox updated with notes in her own handwriting, a continuation of the record her father had started. One afternoon in May of that year, a car she didn't recognize came down the long gravel driveway. It was Mr. Garrity. He looked older than he had 2 years ago. The farm crisis had left marks on everyone in the business of farm credit, on different faces in different ways, but it had left marks. He stood by his car and looked at her fields, which were greening in long, even rows, and at her equipment shed, whose doors were open in the warm afternoon, the Alice Chalmers visible inside, clean and maintained. He looked at the farmhouse with its new front porch railing she'd installed herself last fall. He took off his hat. "Your winter wheat last season," he said, "was the best in the county." I looked at the elevator records. He turned the hat in his hands. "I drove by here in October and I saw it coming in, and I didn't know what to make of it." Cecily was on one knee beside the front wheel of the tractor, wiping grease from a fitting. She finished what she was doing before she answered. "It was a good stand," she said. "No," he said. "It wasn't a good year. It was a terrible year for almost everyone else." He was quiet for a moment. "I've had to call in a lot of loans this year, Cecily. Men who'd been farming for 30 years. Families who thought they'd figured out how to do it bigger and better." He shook his head slowly. "I came here today because I wanted to say something to you that I should have said 2 years ago. I saw a young woman with a hard situation and I showed you the easiest door out. That was my job, I suppose. But it wasn't right. I should have asked what Tom Bowen's daughter knew about running a farm. I should have assumed you knew more than I did." Cecily stood up and faced him. "Your father was the most careful farmer I ever lent money to," Mr. Garrity said. "And I'm looking at this place, and I think maybe careful was the right word all along." He put his hand out. She wiped her palm on a rag and shook it. After he drove away, she went back to her work. 6 weeks later, a truck she recognized came down the driveway. Mitchell's truck. He'd gotten a newer one, she noticed. He parked and got out and stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the farm. He looked at the fields and the equipment shed and the farmhouse, and she could see him taking it in differently this time. Not calculating. Something else. She came out onto the porch and watched him. She felt when she saw him something quieter than she'd expected. Not anger, not even old hurt particularly, just a kind of remove, the feeling of standing on solid ground and looking at something that had once seemed important. He walked over to the porch steps and stopped. "I heard in town what happened to the Tillman place," he said, "and the Wexlers, and pretty much everyone." He looked at her. "And I drove by here last fall and your fields they looked different. Better than anybody else's." She waited. "I don't know how to say this right," he said, "so I'll just say it. I told you this place was a liability. I told you your father's way of doing things was sentimental and outdated." He looked at his shoes, then back at her. "I was wrong about that. I was so wrong about it. I'm still kind of amazed by how wrong I was." He lifted his eyes to the fields behind her. "I thought bigger was always better. I thought you had to borrow to grow. Your father knew something different, and I was too sure of myself to see it." He paused. "I just wanted to tell you that, and to say I'm sorry for leaving the way I did. You deserved better than that." The apology sat between them in the spring air. She let it be what it was, real. She could tell that. And too late for anything, which was also real. "Thank you for saying it," she told him. And she meant it. He nodded, and after a moment he walked back to his truck, and she watched him go, and she felt the last of something settle and go still. Let me take you forward now. Far past the hard years, past the recovery, into a summer morning some 2 decades later. Cecily Bowen is not the frightened 27-year-old in the kitchen anymore. She is in her late 40s, her dark hair gone partially gray in a way she doesn't think about, her hands so used to the particular grammar of farm work that they move through it automatically, without effort, the way a musician's hands move through a song they've played 1,000 times. The farm is still 940 acres. She never expanded beyond it. She invested instead in the soil, in the equipment's upkeep, in the slow, compounding intelligence of land that has been respected rather than stripped. The farm turns a modest, consistent profit every year. She owns every acre of it outright. The old Alice Chalmers is still in the shed. It is something of a landmark now. People who know old equipment come to look at it sometimes, disbelieving that it still runs as well as it does. It runs that well because it has been maintained meticulously for 40 years, because every repair has been logged and every symptom noticed early and every part replaced at the right time rather than the last minute. The green metal lockbox is on the workbench where it has always been. It is thick now with pages, the original entries in Thomas Bowen's careful block letters, then years of Cecily's handwriting, smaller and more angular, continuing the record without interruption. In the summers, her niece's son, a 22-year-old named Cooper, with the particular eagerness of someone who genuinely wants to learn something, comes to work the farm. He is not from farming. He grew up in Denver. He knows how to navigate apps and optimize digital workflows, and he came to the farm the first summer somewhat confident that he could improve its systems. Cecily let him discover, gradually and without embarrassment, that the systems already worked. On a July afternoon, she finds him in the equipment shed, turning a wheel bearing in his hands, frowning at it. "How do I know if it's gone?" he asks her. She takes it from him and spins it between her palms. It makes a sound, barely, a soft scraping catch on one rotation. She hands it back and makes him spin it himself. "Feel that?" she says. He spins it. His frown shifts. "Yeah," he says, surprised. "Yeah, I do feel it. That's a bearing starting to fail," she says. "Replace it now. It's a $30 part in an afternoon. Wait until it seizes. It takes the whole hub with it, and you're into a $2,000 repair at the worst possible moment." She nods at the shelf of service manuals. "Pull the manual for the baler. The part number is in there. Your great-great-uncle logged it the first time he replaced one, back in 1979. We ordered from the same supplier every time since." Cooper looks at the manual. He looks at the lockbox. Then he looks at her. "How long did it take to learn all this?" he says. Cecily thinks about the night in 1987, when she sat on the workbench stool and read a service manual until 4 in the morning because there was no alternative. She thinks about the ice storm and the split pipe and the camp stove and the photograph tucked behind the warranty cards. She thinks about the particular silence of a farm at dawn when you are the only one responsible for all of it. "You don't learn it all at once," she says. "You learn it one repair at a time, and you write it down so the next person doesn't have to start from zero." She hands him a pen and opens the lockbox to a fresh page. "Write the date," she tells him. "Write the symptom. Write what you found and what you fixed and what part number you used. And then next time, and the time after that, you'll have something to go on." She pauses. "That's what my father left me. Not just the land, not just the tools. He left me 40 years of paying attention, written down so it wouldn't disappear." Cooper writes the date. His handwriting is looser than Thomas Bowen's, less certain, the handwriting of someone who is just beginning. That is fine. That is exactly right. Every record in the lockbox had to start somewhere. The men who had told Cecily Bowen to sell, the smooth-voiced banker, the ambitious husband, the neighbors at the feed store who'd done their math and found her wanting. They had seen a problem. They had seen a young woman in over her head, an old farm on its last legs, an equation that didn't balance. What they hadn't seen was what was actually there. 4 decades of careful attention written in a green metal box, and a daughter who had been taught, hand by hand and repair by repair, exactly how to read it. The land had not forgotten the man who tended it, and it did not forget his daughter either.